And so I just love listening to people's stories, like,
Hmm.
the things that they went through and stuff like that. So I was like, man, like I really love that, the interview, listening to people's stories. And I really think that sharing our stories is really powerful, right? And it changes the world and everything. So I was like, I want to start a podcast.
So you want to make an impact. You're thinking about starting a business, sharing your voice. How do women do it that handle motherhood, family, and still chase after those dreams? Well, listen each week as we dive into the stories of women who know. This is Call Me CEO.
Welcome back, everyone, to Call Me CEO. This is your host, Camille Walker, and here we celebrate stories of mothers building businesses and making real waves and ripples in the world. And I am so thrilled today we have Heidy De La Cruz with us on the call, and she's going to be telling us about how to launch a podcast successfully as a business owner, as well as what are some SEO tools that you can use today to have more visibility in your podcast. And I'm really excited about this because I just launched a baby brand new podcast called 5 Minute Meditations for Kids. So in addition to this podcast, I now have another one that we're just starting out brand new. So I feel like this will be a good refresher for me and for you if that's something that you're looking to do. So Heidy, thank you so much for being on the call today.
No, thank you so much for providing the space and for me to be able to share my story and some tips with your audience.
Yeah. Well, I failed to mention that your podcast is The American Dream in the Eyes of Immigrants, which is such a
Yes.
beautiful approach to podcasting. How did you get the inspiration to start your own podcast?
Oh my goodness. Well, I've been a fan of podcasts years before I even decided to launch one. And particularly, there was just this one where people will come on, mostly authors, they will share about their book and what brought them to write their book and things like that. And so I just love listening to people's stories, like,
Mm-hmm.
the things that they went through and stuff like that. So I was like, man, like I really love that, the interview, listening to people's stories, and I really love sharing. I really think that sharing our stories is really powerful, right? And it changes the world and everything. So I was like, I want to start a podcast. So it was going to be just like me and, people that I know, and just sharing the good thing that God was doing in their lives and how they're impacting the community around them. But again, I had wanted to start a podcast and I didn't for years, which is actually very common for people who want to launch.
Mm-hmm.
They have
Yes.
that itch for years and they don't actually do it until like, 2, 3 years later. So that's the same thing that happened to me. So finally, I was on maternity leave in 2022 and I was like, oh, I have some extra time. Let me start this podcast that I still want to start. So as I'm researching, literally Googling how to launch a podcast, gathering, all the information, I'm like, okay, what do I want this to be? And then all of a sudden I come across this article on Medium, and it was this article about an immigrant who came from Kenya, and she was sharing how each cultural shock that she experienced in the United States really diminished her confidence in herself. And I was like, oh my God, this really hit home because my parents are immigrants. They came from the Dominican Republic in the 90s. I was born here. And then my husband is also an immigrant. He also came from the Dominican Republic when he was 9 years old. So, just a lot of things came to mind, like my family stories, my husband's story. And so after reading that article, I went up to my husband and I was like, hey, you came when you were 9 years old. That's young. Do you remember like how you felt, the experience and things like that? And he was like, yeah, very vividly. So he's telling me his story of like when they first landed in New York. So from the Dominican Republic, very tropical Caribbean, island, to concrete jungle, right? And he
Yes.
was like, the shock of it all. And so as a 9-year old, it impacted him. So he's telling me his story. I'm like, okay, that's what my podcast is going to be about. We're going to share immigrant stories. We are going to share about coming to the United States, what brought them here, how was life back home, and we talk about cultural shocks that they experience. If anyone helped them, who helped them, how did that help come about? And it's funny because a lot of the majority of people, like the church community, is like really involved in like helping them get situated and things like that, which I find that so beautiful. So that's how my podcast, The American Dream in the Eyes of Immigrants, came about. And it was really just kind of a tribute to like my family's journey, is my husband's journey, and just a journey of all the immigrants out there that come to this great country.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that you're sharing those stories, especially where I feel like a lot of the stories shared in that spotlight through the news are not happy stories and can focus on the negative. And so the fact that you're getting those real on the ground stories is so powerful, because there is still the American dream that can happen, and it isn't all negative. So that's really cool. So let's talk about shifting gears to launching a podcast, because like you said, I even thought for a few years before I launched my own podcast, if I should do it, if it was oversaturated, if I had what it took. So let's go through some of those frequently asked questions that you get of how to start a podcast and if it's a good idea.
Yeah. So you touched one, is it too saturated? And it's like, it seems like nowadays everybody and their mothers has a podcast, right? And it reminds me of like back in the day, like when everybody was blogging, you know, like that was a big thing. And it's like, oh, everyone has a blog. So now it's like, oh, everyone has a podcast. But the thing is that a lot of people don't know is that actually the percentage of podcasters who don't make it past the 10th episode is really high. It's like over 90%.
Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, there's a lot of podcasts out there, but there's not a lot of active podcasts, right? Like we'll start, podcasters will start, and then they will just die off, and then they'll probably relaunch years later when, you know, things like that. So that's one of the biggest things is like, if you're thinking about launching a podcast, my biggest tip is to know your why. Why is it that you want to start a podcast? What is it that you want to talk about? Is it something that is passion driven? Because you know, you can make money for podcasts, but just like building a business, just like building a blog, everything takes time, right? So I really tell my clients and everyone to just really hone down on what is your why. And then write down at least like 3 to 5 goals that you would like to reach with the podcast. And then also think about your mission and your vision. So what is the mission with the podcast? What is it that you're trying to achieve? And then what is the vision? Like, where do you see the podcast going? Let's say 5 years from now, right? So that's how I really start with my clients and the tips that I give people. Because podcasting is a lot of fun. Like, I love this. I love being a guest. I love connecting with others. I love sharing the immigrant stories, but there is so much work behind the scenes that goes into podcasting. And that's why a lot of people like don't really realize until they're in it. And it's like, oh man, this is a lot. So that's why a lot of people don't make it past the 10th episode. But I really like to set people up with a plan, really, you know, honing down your why. What are we going to talk about? How often are you able to publish? How often, you know, are you going to edit? Are you going to be able to outsource that? So there's a few things to think about, but most importantly, I say like, start off with your why. Why do you want to start?
I agree with that 100%. In fact, a freebie that I have on my website, camillewalker.co, is Discover Your Why. Because whether it is starting the blog, the business, the podcast, whatever the thing is, you really have to be cozy with that why, because there will be hard times where you'll ask yourself, why am I doing this? And you need to have a really solid foundation of remembering why, what those reasons were. Do you think that that's hard for them to define, or is that something that seems to come pretty easily?
It really depends. Like, I've had clients who just immediately knew right away why they wanted to start and what they wanted to talk about. And there are some clients who are just like, well, I have a lot of things that I want to talk about. I'm interested in a lot of things. Like, how do I narrow down? So when I have those clients, what I have them do is like, okay, your first homework. And if there's anybody out there who's in the same boat, you can do this too. So your first homework is brainstorm and brain dump all the ideas, all the topics that you want to talk about, right? Write them all down and see if there is a common denominator between them. If you can find a common denominator, then you can go ahead and niche down to that. And then from there, you can expand, right? So that's what I have people do, because yes, like that happened to me when I, as a writer, like I was like, oh, I need to, you know, niche down. And it's like, I don't know, like I like talking, I like writing about very different things. And now I'm just writing about podcasting and sharing tips about podcasting. So eventually, you know, I was able to niche down, but so just brain dump all the ideas that you may have and just see if there's anything, a common denominator. And then that way you can go from there.
I like that. What do you think is one of the hardest hurdles for people starting a podcast?
Getting over listening to their own voice recording. Yes. It happened to me, like, you know, you always like watch those videos or like recordings, like, I don't want to hear my voice. But then as you get your reps in and like you keep recording episodes, you get over that. So like, for example, I would record, reels on Instagram, and like my husband will listen to them. Like next thing I'll be like, no, like don't, I don't want to hear myself.
I don't want to hear myself. Yeah.
Yeah. Now it's just whatever. It's like, oh, I'll tell him like, hey, I have a new podcast out. Like, you want to listen to it? Like, let's watch it, together. Cause it's just something that you would get over, just as you get your reps in.
Yes, I agree with that. That goes the same for recording reels or making it, any kind of social media where you're seeing your face or you're hearing your voice. One way that if you're not quite used to that and you want to practice hearing and listening and seeing yourself is Marco Polo. I love to have people that I'm coaching start out with seeing and hearing themselves talk on Marco Polo, because it's something you could do private or you could do with a friend, but it's getting used to seeing your mannerisms, your voice, the way you look on camera. And if there's something you want to change, you can, but most of the time it's really just the repetition. Like you said, getting used to what you look and hear like. Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, I agree with that 100%. Let's switch into SEO, because I feel like when you're launching that podcast, you have your why, you know what the topic is, you're excited about it, you get the gear. What is the best practice for descriptions, tags, titles? What are some tools that you use to make it really SEO friendly so it's discoverable?
Yeah, just once you discover your topic, then you're able to discover, your keywords. What are the keywords that you're going to be using in your podcast title, which is important, in your podcast description, which is telling people what the podcast is about. So you definitely want to have keywords in there. And then, your episode titles, you definitely want to have keywords in there as well. And just so everyone knows, like wherever you listen to podcasts, right? Whether it's Apple Podcasts, whether it's Spotify, wherever it is, they have their own algorithm. So they have their own searchability, right? So if you go and you want to find a podcast, let's say on business, right? You will type in podcast for business. So whatever podcast is high on SEO with the keyword business will come up. So that's what you want to think about when you're launching your podcast. It's like, what is the word or keywords that I want to be discovered for? Right. So for example, mine is about immigrants. So my keyword is immigrants, and it is in my title, although it is the last word, but it should, you should have it closer to the first word, your keyword, right? And then also in my podcast description, where I share what my podcast is about, it's about sharing the stories of immigrants coming to the United States. So just making sure that those keywords are there so people can find your show within the podcast listening platforms.
Is there a tool or something that you use to help you come up with your keywords or your subtitles or the titles of your show?
Yeah, so you can use, I believe is Google Keyword. I can't remember the exact name. It's in Google that you can use to find what like the most popular keywords are. You can see what people are searching on Google and what's trending, right? So you can definitely use that. And then I also, when I'm coming up with podcast titles, I run my title through capitalizemytitle.com. And what that does is you would put your title in and it will give you a score on how good this title will rank or not. And you want that score to be over 60. So if it's less than 60, I think it gets like a yellow light. And then if it's like really bad, it'll get like a red light. So you want to think of green, good, right? So you want to get a score of 60 or higher. And then you can also click on it. And then it'll also give you like a breakdown of like the reliability score, the SEO score. And I can't remember what the other one is, but it will tell you if it's SEO good. I also like to use ChatGPT to try to generate ideas for different podcast titles. So if you know what your podcast, it's going to be about, then you can tell ChatGPT like, hey, give me 20 SEO friendly podcast episodes for this topic, right? And of those 20s, run them through Capitalize My Title and see which one has the highest SEO score. And then there you go.
I like that. Using those two together, that's really smart. I have used ChatGPT to even upload, say I've written a blog post and I say I want to rank for certain keywords. I will also ask ChatGPT to write a meta description. This is more for the actual blog post, not so much the podcast, but you can have it help you write social captions or meta descriptions, alt tags. so that it kind of does the hard work for you. Oh my
Mm-hmm.
gosh, ChatGPT saves so much time. I love the
Yes.
idea of using it with the capitalize my title. That is gold.
Mm-hmm.
I'm for sure going to have to do that.
Yeah.
So when you are launching a baby new podcast, what are some ways that you like to maximize the launch of that podcast? I know there's some different tactics and tools for this to try to hit the charts, but I'm curious what you would say.
So I like to break things down into like little tasks, right? So it's not overwhelming because there's just so much moving parts when it comes to launching a podcast. So I like to say I like to help people launch the simple way. So we'll break things down, like I said, starting with our why, and then getting into like the goals and what we're going to talk about. I also like for the clients to really think of that target audience. So really that one person, right? That avatar. So like when they do with writing, yes, same thing with podcasting, like really think of that avatar, like who you're going to be talking to, get specific, male, female, age range, income bracket. Are they moms? Are they not moms? Things like that. And so just really try to take it one step at a time because there is a lot out there. And it can get overwhelming. And that's how I was at first when I was literally Googling how to launch a podcast. So much information out there that I was so overwhelmed. And I was like, okay, I need to take this one step at a time. So when I was creating my course, that's like, I went back to like when I was launching my podcast, I was like, okay, how would I do it this time? Right. And I really would like for people to set a realistic timeline because I know like people are like, oh, just press record and go ahead. Right. But I'm like, no, you really want to plan it and really want to, do things on the right foot. So really plan out, I say like 6 weeks should be like a good space for you to launch your podcast. And yes, there are many tools out there. Like I said, the capitalize my title for the SEO and things, but then also, even for editing, like I came across a few months ago, this website called Auphonic. And it removes, background noise. It removes, unwanted noise, right, from the background, and it really makes your audio crisp. And they offer 2 hours for free of editing. So you run your audio through there. It will remove whatever it is that you wanted to remove, and then you can listen to the difference too. You can listen to how it sounded before Auphonic and how it was afterwards, and it's just been it's just been so good to using that platform for the editing of the audio.
Oh, that is really nice. Is it Auphonic, ALPHONIC?
It is AUPHONIC. Auphonic. I probably mispronounced it. It's the Spanish in me. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I just wanted to make sure we heard what that was. That's really helpful. Yes. Which hosting platform do you like to use for your podcasts?
So I am using Spotify for podcasters because of the video portion of it. But even before they had the video, that was the one that kept coming up when I was researching Spotify for podcasters. And so from the jump, I've used it and I've liked it because it works for me, but I know that it gets, some, like a lot of other podcasters don't like it. They say to use a paid service better. Supposedly it pushes out your content more. But it's been working for me. People have been finding my podcasts and things like that. So that's the one that I am using. But I've had clients who use Simplecast, some use Buzzsprout, Podbean. My biggest thing is like, just because I use Spotify for podcasters, I don't try to sway my clients to use those. I always say, let's do research. What is it that you need for your podcast? Because what you need may be different than what I need. Not everybody has a video podcast and not everybody needs a video podcast. So they don't need the video aspect of Spotify, right? So I really tell people just to do their research on like the biggest ones and just see what features they have and what actually they need for their podcast.
Yeah, that's helpful. The one that I just launched, the 5-minute meditations for kids, we love that Spotify has video too, because we have video that goes with the audio. And it's been so fun to see it because I use Buzzsprout for my distribution. And so I hadn't really paid a lot of attention to that video aspect, which is really helpful. Do you put your podcast on YouTube as well?
I do, but I don't use the RSS feed that they just put out there when they got removed the Google podcast. I just put my video on YouTube, like if it was a regular YouTube video. And I don't have a specific reason why I haven't used it. I just know that, like, you know, YouTube has been a video platform from the jump. And so they have their own algorithm and their own search engine. So I just rather put the video on there.
Work with it
But
there.
yeah, worth it there. So but if you want to use the RSS feed, you know, it's there for you and people can, you know, listen to your podcast there and things like that. But I just see YouTube as more of video than a podcast platform right now. I mean, it could change in the future, just how things are going, but that's just me and my personal preference.
Yeah. One thing to keep in mind for YouTube, especially, is that it is its own search engine as well.
Yes.
So if you're, like the podcast I just launched, 5-minute meditations for kids, when I search that on Google, it's videos that pop up more than anything else. And so immediately from the jump, we were like, okay, we need video, because that's where a lot of the searches is going to pop to the top, is the video. Where on Call Me CEO podcast, it's more business oriented, it's just a different kind of podcast. So I am still putting videos on YouTube for this podcast, but it's not for the same purpose. It's not as much of a priority, I guess. But video is the future, they say, in everything. So if you're recording the audio, I assume may as well just record the video and put it up if you can. Those baby steps, but that's just what I think. So with recording the podcast, where do you like to tell people to film?
So I use Zoom, and the reason why I use Zoom is because a lot of my guests are not podcasters, and everybody knows how to use Zoom, so I don't really have to like teach them. But I know that Riverside is really popular, and Riverside also has where it creates video clips for you.
Yes.
Right in there. Yeah. And it transcribes the video. So it's really good. It transcribes the video. So you have that as well. And I know that a lot of people like to use, I think it's Chromecast, the other one that a lot of people like to use. So I've heard really good things about those two platforms. But me, I use Zoom just because it's easier for my guests.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. And the video quality is good enough. And if you want, you can get a webcam. But for me, it's been fine that I bought a webcam and then I didn't end up using it, which I think it's interesting, the things you learn going through it and then launching a second podcast. I'm like, oh, this is easier, because the first time everything just feels so foreign, and then you do it again and you're like, oh, this isn't as scary or as overwhelming as it needs to be. Yeah. Well, this has been really helpful. What last tips or hangups would you suggest for people, maybe in lessons you've learned the hard way from helping people do something and seeing people get tripped up in doing it the hard way?
What I love to tell people all the time is whatever it is that you want to start, whether it is a business, whether it is a blog, whether it is a podcast, is to reach out to someone who's doing it and ask questions. You'll be surprised how willing people are to help. And I say this because I did it myself, the podcast, and I was so overwhelmed, which is why I became a podcast coach and to help others, because of my experience and how overwhelmed I was. And I didn't know anyone around me, like no family members, no friends were launching podcasts when I was doing it. And so like, I really didn't have anyone to lean to. So I really highly suggest, like, whatever it is that you're trying to launch or start, reach out to someone who's doing it. More people are willing to help than not, and then just get those tips and things like that, and learn from other people's mistakes, you know, so you don't have to make the same ones.
Yeah, I would reiterate that with asking for help and then also getting the support you need, because for me, it was more of setting up a system where I don't have the bandwidth to edit and distribute the way that I would like to, but sometimes you have to start there, and that's okay. But for me, I was like, it's not going to work unless I have a system where I can record and send for it to be edited and then sent back. And that has been a game changer for me. So just really understand your bandwidth of starting a podcast with something you can maintain, because I think in the beginning, we have all these good intentions of showing up and doing it and making it all line up perfectly. But sometimes it's about getting that support. And if you need help with that, you know that I help with that. And I help line people up with virtual assistants who can help you do that for your business. So this has been so great, Heidi. I'm so grateful that you are sharing your voice, helping people launch podcasts. I do think that stories we share, and especially ones with so much purpose that you're sharing, is what really is changing minds and giving ideas and giving people the courage to share their own voice, which is, I hope, what is the message that is being delivered today for everyone listening.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. All right. Well, everyone, thank you for tuning into this episode. Make sure that you are subscribed and leave a 5-star rating so that others can find and discover these amazing stories of mothers building businesses and changing the world. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Hey CEOs, thank you so much for spending your time with me. If you found this episode inspiring or helpful, please let me know in a comment and a 5-star review. You could have the chance of being a featured review on an upcoming episode. Continue the conversation on Instagram at Call Me CEO Podcast. And remember, you are the boss.